The war did not enter the hospitals with explosions. It entered with paperwork. June 1940. The German advance through France was not chaotic. It was engineered. Armored divisions bypassed fortified lines, severed supply routes, and collapsed command structures in weeks. French units retreated, fragmented, surrendered. By the time the armistice was signed, hundreds of thousands of French soldiers were either captured or wounded. The wounded were the complication. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical facilities were protected. Under occupation, protection meant oversight. German military administrators did not shut down French hospitals. They absorbed them. Orders were issued quickly. All military personnel receiving treatment were to be registered as prisoners of war. Identification numbers were assigned. German medical officers were dispatched to major hospitals to assess patient conditions. Those fit for transport would be transferred to detention camps in the Reich. Those unfit would remain under guard until stabilized. In Paris, hospital corridors changed tone overnight. Uniformed Wehrmacht soldiers stood beside reception desks. Entry logs were examined. Supply deliveries were counted. Civilian staff were required to present identification at every shift. The occupation did not remove the French medical staff. It relied on them. German authorities needed experienced nurses and surgeons to keep prisoners alive enough to be moved. That was the first tension. For the nursing staff, healing a man meant strengthening the hand that would chain him. Transport lists were updated weekly. Name, rank, unit, wound classification, recovery status. A column marked estimated date of transfer determined how long a man would remain in the ward. Most soldiers understood what the date meant. POW camps in Germany were not execution sites, but they were systems of labor. Industrial work details, agricultural assignments, minimal rations, years of confinement, letters censored, survival uncertain. Some patients begged to be discharged early and attempt escape on their own. That was impossible. Hospital exits were guarded, street patrols frequent, identification checks random and aggressive. Any soldier found without papers would be detained immediately. Inside the wards, nurses moved between beds with clinical precision. They changed dressings, measured pulse rates, administered morphine, recorded temperatures, and they observed. They observed which guards were inattentive, which officers trusted French documentation, which departments had secondary stairwells rarely used. Hospitals are complex organisms. Supply chains, laundry routes, pharmacy storage, waste disposal, morgue access, kitchen deliveries. Occupation forces controlled entrances and patient registries. They did not yet understand the infrastructure. German command believed control of records equaled control of bodies. They were wrong. The first weeks were about compliance. Staff followed every directive. They submitted reports on time. They assisted German medical inspections without protest. Trust had to be cultivated before it could be exploited. In one Paris hospital, a senior nurse began quietly memorizing the pattern of weekly audits. German officers reviewed patient files every Thursday morning. They cross-checked physical presence against registry logs. They focused primarily on men expected to recover within 10 days. The severely wounded received less scrutiny. A man with a compound fracture or abdominal infection was not a transport priority. That detail mattered. The occupation authorities operated on
Scalpel support steps are
efficiency.
done.
Resources
Good.
were
Check the
directed where they
retractors. Will
produced
do. Almost
results.
finished.
The war effort required labor. Labor required bodies capable of standing. Those unable to stand were temporarily irrelevant. Within that irrelevance lay opportunity. The nurses did not meet formally. There were no written plans. But conversations began in controlled fragments, in sterilization rooms, in stairwells between shifts, during cigarette breaks in courtyards where German guards rarely lingered. The question was simple. What happens if a man is no longer on the list? Not transferred, not discharged, not recorded as deceased, just absent. The answer initially was uncertain. German administration depended on documentation chains. A missing signature triggered inquiries. A missing file triggered reprimands. A missing body triggered investigation. But what if the absence appeared procedural? Hospitals produce ambiguity naturally. Patients are moved between departments. Charts are updated by hand. Conditions fluctuate. Paper can lag behind reality. If a soldier's recovery was slowed, even artificially, his transfer date could be postponed. Postponement meant time. Time meant planning. The earliest adjustment happened without coordination. A nurse recorded a mild infection as unstable. Another extended a fever chart by 2 days. A surgical note described swelling that had already subsided. Small deviations, nothing dramatic enough to raise suspicion. When Thursday audits arrived, the numbers still aligned. The man remained in his bed. For now. These were not acts of defiance declared aloud. They were calibrations, testing how far paperwork could stretch before resistance became visible. The German officers accepted the reports. They trusted structure. Hospitals thrive on structure. So do occupying armies. But one is built to preserve life, the other to control it. The collision between those purposes had only begun. By late summer 1940, something subtle had shifted inside several hospitals across occupied France. The nurses were no longer thinking in terms of delay. They were thinking in terms of removal, not postponement, extraction. And extraction required more than altered ink. It required coordination beyond a single ward. It required understanding the building as a system. Because if a man were to vanish from the registry without alerting the machinery above, the disappearance would have to look like it belonged there. The question was no longer whether it was possible. The question was, how many people would have to risk everything to make it work? And that answer would not be found in the patient files. It would be found in the spaces between them. Extraction could not begin with movement. It had to begin with predictability. The nurses needed to know exactly how the German oversight functioned, not in theory, but in daily practice. By early autumn 1940, patterns had emerged. Audits were thorough but narrow. German officers verified names against physical presence, but they rarely re-examined medical conclusions unless a case appeared suspiciously improved. They deferred to French surgeons on technical diagnoses. Language barriers reinforced that deference. Complex surgical terminology created distance. That distance created cover. Within the wards, the nurses began categorizing patients mentally. Category 1. Those too severely wounded to travel for months. Category 2. Those expected to recover within weeks. Category 3. Those nearly fit. Priority for transfer. Category 3 men were the danger group. Their files were pulled more often. their charts reviewed with interest, their guards more attentive. If an extraction system were to be tested, it could not begin there. It would begin with Category 2. Men stable enough to survive movement, but not yet flagged for immediate transport. The first coordinated delay was deliberate. A corporal recovering from a leg fracture was due for reassessment. His bone had set properly. Mobility exercises had begun. Under normal progression, he would be transferred within 10 days. Instead, a note was added. Secondary inflammation observed. An X-ray was rescheduled. Physical therapy paused. The inflammation did not exist, but the paperwork did. During audit, the German officer glanced at the chart and nodded. Reassess next week. 1 week became 2. 2 became 3. The corporal remained in his bed. Nothing happened. No reprimand, no inquiry. The system absorbed the deviation. That was confirmation. But delay alone was not enough. Sooner or later, recovery would be undeniable. Bones heal. Wounds close. Muscles strengthen. The next test would determine whether a man could be moved inside the hospital without triggering registry correction. It happened at night. Hospitals do not sleep. But after midnight, the tempo changes. Administrative staff depart. Senior officers leave the premises. Guard rotations thin. A patient from Ward C was quietly transferred to Ward F under the justification of infection isolation. The transfer slip was filed, but not immediately updated in the master registry. When Thursday audit arrived, the German officer searched Ward C. The bed was empty. The nurse on duty presented the transfer slip. The officer frowned, examined it, then walked to Ward F to confirm physical presence. The soldier was there, breathing, recovering. The file was corrected. The oversight had been procedural, not malicious. Again, no punishment. The nurses had learned something critical. Movement within the building was tolerated if documented, even imperfectly. The registry was reactive, not predictive. It followed paperwork. It did not anticipate deviation. That realization shifted the scale of ambition. The goal was no longer postponement, it was dislocation. If a man could be moved repeatedly between departments, surgery, recovery, infectious disease, radiology, his paper trail would grow complex. Complexity reduces clarity. Clarity is required for enforcement. Meanwhile, beyond the wards, another calculation was forming. Hospitals generate outputs besides patients. Laundry carts exit daily. Food supply crates arrive and depart. Medical waste is transported. Ambulances move between facilities for specialist care. Each route had documentation. Each document had signatures. Each signature could be influenced. A nurse in the surgical wing had a brother who worked as a hospital orderly. An orderly had access to basement corridors and loading bays. Loading bays connected to delivery vehicles. The building was not a prison. It was a machine with multiple exits. Still, extraction beyond the hospital required something more dangerous than falsified charts. It required civilian papers. Every French citizen carried identification under occupation. Checkpoints were frequent, curfews enforced. Without proper documents, a man would be detained within minutes. Inside the hospital, soldiers wore patient gowns. Outside, they would need names, new names. The nurses could manipulate medical files. They could not forge national identity cards alone. That realization forced expansion. Quietly, cautiously, contact extended beyond hospital walls. A pharmacist's cousin worked in municipal administration. A hospital clerk had access to archived birth certificates. A sympathetic priest in a nearby parish maintained baptismal records. None of them were approached with a grand plan. Each was asked for something small: a blank form, a misplaced registry number. An old identity card reported damaged. No one yet understood the scale of what was forming, but fragments were aligning. Inside the wards, the delays continued. Not excessive, not reckless, measured. One man developed a persistent cough. Another required extended observation for internal bleeding. A third experienced a complication during suture removal. Each note bought days. Days accumulated. With time secured, the nurses began identifying which patients had the psychological resilience for escape. Not every soldier could vanish successfully. Some were too weak, some too frightened, some too attached to the familiarity of structured captivity. Extraction required silence, endurance, and obedience to instruction. The nurses interviewed them indirectly. Questions asked during dressing changes. Do you have family in the countryside? Have you ever traveled near the Swiss border? Can you walk 5 kilometers without assistance? Answers were memorized, nothing written. A list formed, not on paper, but in shared memory among a small circle of staff. Meanwhile, German supervision subtly intensified. Rumors had reached command that small numbers of French POWs were disappearing in transit across the country, not specifically from hospitals, but from work details and rail transfers. The response was procedural tightening, more frequent headcounts, occasional surprise inspections, cross-checking of registry copies between local headquarters and hospital administration. The nurses noticed immediately. Risk calculations shifted. Delays could no longer be extended indefinitely. Extraction windows would have to narrow. A man could not remain in Category 2 forever without drawing attention. He would either be downgraded permanently as unfit, suspicious, or upgraded to Category 3. Neither outcome was safe. So the first true disappearance was scheduled, not impulsively, not emotionally, but as an operational test. A soldier recovering from shrapnel wounds to the shoulder, mobility restored, infection cleared, transfer expected within 5 days. He had a rural upbringing, strong legs, no visible deformity, and most importantly, he had family near the Loire Valley. On paper, he would be moved for specialist radiological evaluation at another facility. The paperwork would be authentic. The destination would not be. On the night before the scheduled audit, preparations began in silence. No speeches, no declarations of resistance, just routine tasks performed with slightly altered intention. Because if the system could be bent once, truly bent, then the hospital would cease to be a holding area. It would become a passage point. And passage points, once established, change the geography of occupation. The paperwork was prepared 3 days in advance. A transfer authorization was typed using the hospital's standard format. The header was correct. The reference stamp authentic. The signature of the attending physician genuine. The destination listed was a radiology unit on the southern edge of Paris. That unit existed. The appointment did not. The soldier was informed only hours before movement, not during daylight, not when other patients were alert. After evening medication rounds, when ward lights were dimmed and footsteps echoed instead of carried. A nurse explained the sequence in controlled, practical terms. You will be transferred at 2:10. You will not speak unless addressed. You will walk without hesitation. If stopped, you are febrile and disoriented. No dramatics. No reassurance. He nodded. At 01:45, an orderly unlocked the internal medicine supply corridor that connected to the basement lift. This corridor was rarely monitored. It led primarily to storage rooms and laundry staging. At 02:05, the guard assigned to Ward C stepped outside for a cigarette. His routine was known. He smoked at consistent intervals. Timing mattered more than courage. The soldier changed from patient gown into civilian trousers and a coat brought earlier in a laundry bundle. The clothing was plain. Nothing military remained visible. A folded cap concealed the close-cropped haircut typical of soldiers. His hospital wrist tag was removed. The bedsheets were reshaped to simulate a resting body beneath blankets. At 02:10, the nurse and orderly escorted him into the corridor. No rush, no whispered urgency. They walked as staff transporting a weak patient. The basement lift descended slowly, mechanical, loud enough to mask quiet conversation. On the ground level, the loading bay was dark, except for one overhead lamp. An ambulance waited, engine off. The driver was not hospital staff. He was introduced only as Mark. His credentials were not discussed. The rear doors opened. Inside, a stretcher was positioned near the entrance. The soldier lay down, covered partially with a blanket. A clipboard rested on his chest. If inspected, the scenario would appear legitimate. The route to the supposed radiology unit required passing 2 checkpoints. Checkpoint 1. A German patrol stationed near the river crossing. Checkpoint 2. Municipal police verifying curfew exemptions. The ambulance departed at 02:22. Inside the hospital, the registry reflected transferred 02:15. During Thursday audit, the German officer would see a routine movement. The first checkpoint appeared sooner than expected. A lantern signaled halt. 2 soldiers approached. Documents were requested. Mark presented transfer papers through the window. The guard examined them with visible boredom. Ambulances were common. Injured prisoners required movement. The war demanded efficiency. A flashlight beam entered the rear compartment. The soldier kept his eyes half closed, his breathing slow. The guard did not touch him. The light withdrew. Proceed. The second checkpoint required more explanation. Municipal police questioned late-night travel, even for medical reasons. Curfew enforcement had tightened recently. Mark argued administrative urgency, radiological scheduling delays, German directives. The tone was respectful, not defensive. A brief pause. A stamped pass was returned. The vehicle continued south. But it did not turn toward the radiology unit. Instead, it diverted before the river, taking a narrower road leading toward the outskirts of the city. After 30 minutes, the ambulance entered the courtyard of a convent. The gates were opened without knocking. Inside, 2 women in religious habit waited beside a side entrance. No greeting was exchanged beyond acknowledgement. The soldier stepped out. His new identity papers were handed to him, folded, slightly worn, believable. Name: Henri Valette. Occupation: agricultural laborer. Place of birth: Tours. He was instructed to remain inside the convent for 3 days. After that, a contact would escort him to a rural farm beyond German patrol density. The ambulance departed immediately. Back at the hospital, the nurse returned to Ward C before 300. The bed remained shaped beneath blankets. At 6:30, morning rounds began. At 9:15, the German audit officer arrived. He checked the registry. Transferred at 2:15. He nodded. He did not request confirmation from the radiology unit. Why would he? The paperwork was correct. The body had moved. 3 days later, a discreet message reached the hospital through indirect channels. Henri Valette had reached the Loire Valley, alive. The first extraction had succeeded. Inside the hospital, no celebration occurred. Success was not safety. A single disappearance could be explained, an anomaly, if noticed at all. A pattern would be different. Over the next weeks, the nurses analyzed every detail of the operation. Timing between audits, guard behavior under fatigue, checkpoint interaction tone, ambulance fuel documentation. Each element was reviewed in quiet fragments of conversation. Mistakes were identified. The bed simulation had been unnecessary. By morning, the registry already showed transfer. Future operations would remove that step. The radiology unit listed as destination might eventually notice a discrepancy. A more distant facility would create less risk of verification. Most importantly, they recognized a structural vulnerability. German officers rarely verified completed transfers unless external reports contradicted them. If the receiving facility did not complain, the transfer was assumed successful. That meant one thing: disappearance had to extend beyond the hospital. Records at destination facilities would need to align or never be expected, which required broader coordination. The operation could not remain isolated within one building. It needed nodes, and nodes required trust. Trust, under occupation, was the rarest resource of all, because as extraction expanded, so would scrutiny. And scrutiny was already approaching. In late October, a German administrative memo circulated among Paris hospitals. It referenced irregularities in prisoner transport documentation. No accusations, no names, but the tone had shifted. Headcounts would increase. Cross-institution verification would begin. The window for improvisation was closing. If the nurses intended to continue, they would have to evolve from opportunistic delay into structured network. And networks, once formed, are harder to hide, but harder to destroy. The hospital was no longer simply bending the system. It was preparing to build something parallel to it. Parallel systems cannot rely on coincidence. They require structure, even if that structure is invisible. After the October memorandum, the atmosphere inside the hospital shifted subtly. German officers were no longer merely verifying presence. They were comparing copies of transfer logs with regional headquarters. The administrative net was tightening. Improvisation would not survive that. So the nurses began mapping relationships. Not on paper, in memory. Who could be trusted beyond routine cooperation? Who had something to lose, but more to gain from defiance? Who had access to tools the hospital did not control? The first expansion point was internal. A surgical registrar named Emile had access to archival storage. He controlled historical patient files, thousands of them. In wartime chaos, records were frequently misplaced, mislabeled, or damaged. If a current file were quietly inserted among old ones, it could become difficult to retrieve quickly during inspection. Emile was approached indirectly, not with ideology, with practicality. Sometimes files are requested twice, a nurse mentioned during evening rounds. Sometimes they are misplaced. It creates confusion. Emile understood. Within weeks, a new procedure emerged. When a soldier was scheduled for extraction, a duplicate file would be created, identical in appearance but incomplete. The original would be relocated temporarily to archival storage under an incorrect year label. If German auditors requested immediate cross-checking, delay would be natural. Retrieval errors were common even before occupation. Delay created space. The second expansion point was transport. Mark, the ambulance driver from the first operation, did not work exclusively for the hospital. He moved between facilities, sometimes under German contract. He was introduced to a mechanic who maintained fuel logs for military vehicles. That mechanic could alter mileage entries subtly, enough to reconcile minor route deviations without triggering review. Fuel documentation had been a vulnerability in the first extraction. Now it became a shield. Next came communication. Direct conversation about operations was dangerous. Telephones were monitored. Written notes could be intercepted. Even casual speech carried risk. Informants existed in every city. So signals were embedded into routine behavior. A folded corner on a patient's temperature chart indicated readiness for movement within 48 hours. A morphine dosage increased by a specific increment meant delay required. Laundry bundles tied with double knots signaled external contact scheduled. None of these signals appeared abnormal. Hospitals are full of minor irregularities. Only those inside the system understood which irregularities mattered. The network extended beyond Paris cautiously. A nurse transferred to Lille carried knowledge with her, not as instructions, but as awareness. There, similar conditions existed: guarded wards, transport lists, administrative oversight. Within months, Lille reported its own irregular transfer. No formal communication confirmed collaboration, but the pattern was spreading. Convents became reliable staging points. Religious institutions maintained partial autonomy under occupation. German forces were hesitant to interfere overtly without cause. Public backlash could follow. This made them useful temporary shelters. However, not every convent was willing. Approach had to be careful. Clergy were tested through smaller requests first. Food for displaced civilians, temporary rest for traveling relatives. Only after trust was established did the conversation widen. One abbess in the outskirts of Reims asked a single question before agreeing to shelter a soldier. Will he obey? The answer determined risk. Obedience meant survival for everyone involved. Forgery capacity improved gradually. A municipal clerk, sympathetic to the cause, provided access to outdated identification templates. Ink composition was studied. Official stamps were replicated using carved rubber and aged manually. Errors were inevitable at first. Ink too dark, paper too clean. Those documents were destroyed. Nothing flawed could circulate. Meanwhile, German oversight grew sharper. In November, a surprise nighttime inspection occurred in one Paris hospital. Officers arrived without notice, counting beds physically rather than relying on registry lists. The nurses adapted instantly. They began preparing contingency patients, individuals medically stable but not scheduled for extraction, who could occupy empty beds temporarily if headcounts shifted unexpectedly. This redundancy added complexity but increased resilience. Extraction was no longer a single operation. It was a cycle. Identify, delay, prepare, transfer internally, extract externally, confirm arrival, erase traces. Each stage required different participants. No individual knew every detail. Compartmentalization was deliberate. If one person were questioned, the network could contract without collapsing. Yet risk multiplied with scale. By winter 1940, at least 6 successful extractions had occurred from the original hospital. Lille reported 3, Reims 2. Numbers remained small deliberately. Large volume would draw statistical attention. The objective was not mass evacuation, it was precision. Each successful disappearance altered morale inside the wards. Soldiers began to sense possibility. Hope can be dangerous under occupation. Too much optimism invites loose speech. The nurses addressed this by limiting knowledge. Only selected patients were informed of potential extraction. Others were told nothing, even if they suspected. Silence preserved safety. Outside hospital walls, the war continued its larger movements. Air raids increased over industrial areas. Food shortages deepened. Civilian resentment grew. In that environment, small acts of defiance multiplied across the country. Sabotage of rail lines, underground newspapers, intelligence leaks. But what was happening inside the hospitals was different. It was not explosive, it was administrative. And administrative resistance is harder to detect, because it uses the occupier's own structure as camouflage. Still, the German command was not blind. Statistical anomalies began appearing in regional prisoner tallies. A minor discrepancy here, a delayed arrival there. Nothing conclusive, but noticeable. An internal review was ordered. Hospitals would be cross-referenced against camp intake records. The network had anticipated this possibility. From this point forward, extracted soldiers would not simply disappear. They would reappear elsewhere. Some would join agricultural labor programs under civilian identities. Others would move south toward unoccupied zones. A few would attempt passage toward Switzerland. If questioned locally, they would exist on paper. The goal shifted again. Not only removal from hospital custody, integration into civilian flow, which meant the operation was evolving beyond medical resistance into coordinated civilian protection. That level of coordination required leadership. Until now, actions had been distributed, shared, informal. But as complexity increased, so did the need for centralized judgment.
Someone would have to decide which risks were acceptable, and someone would eventually become visible. Because the larger the network grew, the harder it would be for all its architects to remain shadows. And in occupied France, visibility had consequences. Leadership in resistance rarely announces itself. It becomes apparent only when decisions begin to concentrate. By early 1941, extraction operations required coordination across at least 4 separate layers: hospital administration, transport logistics, document preparation, and rural shelter placement. Without centralized timing, delays overlapped dangerously. A forged identity might be ready before a transport route was secure. A bed might be emptied before contingency coverage was prepared. The network needed synchronization. In the original Paris hospital, that role gradually settled around one senior surgical nurse, Madeleine Laurent. She did not volunteer. She was already positioned at the center of information flow. She supervised night rotations. She reviewed patient charts before audit days. She maintained direct contact with physicians and orderlies alike. Her authority was administrative, which made it invisible. Madeleine began keeping mental ledgers: which patients were viable, which guards were unpredictable, which external contacts were stable, which routes were temporarily unsafe. She never wrote anything down. Instead, she reduced operations to rhythm. No extraction within 48 hours of a German memorandum. No consecutive removals from the same ward. No transfers on days following aerial bombardment, when patrol density increased. Pattern control became survival. Under her coordination, operations became cleaner. Ambulances no longer returned immediately after delivery. They rerouted through legitimate assignments first. Fuel logs matched mileage precisely. Receiving facilities listed on transfer forms were rotated geographically to avoid repeated references. Identity papers improved. The municipal clerk expanded access to ration cards, critical for civilian survival. Without ration documentation, even a flawless identity card would invite scrutiny. Food distribution under occupation was strictly controlled. A man without ration history was conspicuous. Ration cards were harder to forge. So the network began repurposing the identities of deceased civilians whose deaths had not yet been fully processed through administrative channels. This was not random theft of names. It was careful selection, individuals without close family in urban centers, whose absence would not trigger inquiry. The moral cost of that decision was acknowledged silently, but the alternative was return to captivity. As operations stabilized, extraction frequency increased slightly, but still conservatively, 2 per month from Paris, 1 from Lille, occasional attempts elsewhere. Then came the first structural shock. In March 1941, a transport convoy carrying POWs from a regional hospital in northern France failed to arrive at its designated camp. The convoy had been attacked by an external resistance cell unrelated to the hospital network. Several prisoners escaped. German casualties were reported. The response was immediate and severe. Security tightened nationwide. Hospitals were instructed to submit daily headcounts instead of weekly summaries. Surprise cross-checks multiplied. Gestapo officers began accompanying some audits. The hospital network had not authorized or coordinated the convoy attack, but it would suffer the consequences. Madeleine responded by suspending extractions temporarily. Delay operations continued, minor chart adjustments, extended recoveries, but no removals. The pause was strategic. Any disappearance during heightened scrutiny would be examined with intensity. Patience, again, became essential. Inside the wards, tension rose. Soldiers sensed change in guard behavior. Inspections grew more aggressive. Personal belongings were searched. Conversations monitored. The nurses maintained routine. Routine conceals deviation. Meanwhile, outside contact routes were evaluated. One rural shelter reported increased patrol presence. A convent in the east was questioned regarding guest registries. A transport mechanic was reassigned to a different depot. Network fragility was exposed. Resilience required redundancy. New shelters were identified further from major rail lines. Alternative document sources were explored in smaller municipalities where oversight was less efficient. A secondary ambulance driver was recruited, older, less noticeable, with a legitimate contract transporting civilian patients. By late April, scrutiny eased slightly. German focus shifted toward preparations for operations further east. The hospital network resumed, cautiously. The next extraction would test whether the pause had preserved invisibility. The candidate was different from previous soldiers. He was not enlisted. He was an officer. Lieutenant André Chevalier. Officers were treated with marginally different protocol under occupation. sometimes separated, sometimes interrogated for intelligence. His presence in the hospital carried greater administrative weight. His transfer would be more carefully logged. Madeleine hesitated. High-profile removal increased risk, but Chevalier possessed something valuable: detailed knowledge of rail infrastructure in central France. If he reached resistance networks beyond the hospital system, he could contribute materially. The decision was made. Preparation for his extraction introduced additional layers. His medical chart required more elaborate justification. Officers were less likely to be transferred for minor complications. Documentation needed credibility. A controlled relapse was engineered. Chevalier's wound, a shoulder injury nearly healed, was reopened surgically under the pretext of infection risk. The procedure was genuine but minimal. Recovery time extended naturally without falsification. German medical officers accepted the revision. During this extended recovery, identity papers were prepared under a different strategy. Instead of repurposing a deceased civilian's name, Chevalier would assume the identity of a railway clerk displaced by bombing in another region, a plausible explanation for limited local familiarity. Railway employment granted mobility, mobility granted options. The extraction night was more complex than prior operations. 2 guards had recently rotated into Ward D, unfamiliar with established smoking patterns. Timing adjustments were necessary. The contingency patient protocol was activated in advance in case of surprise count. At 01:30, unexpected footsteps echoed in the corridor, an unscheduled patrol. Madeleine intercepted them personally. She reported a post-operative complication requiring isolation. She invited them to observe from the doorway, controlling their line of sight deliberately. They declined entry, unwilling to risk exposure to infection. The patrol moved on. At 02:05, Chevalier was moved. This time, no ambulance. Instead, he was transferred internally to the hospital morgue. The morgue was refrigerated, but rarely inspected at night. A coffin scheduled for civilian burial the following morning had been prepared with altered contents, weighted fabric replacing the body, which had already been processed earlier in the day. Chevalier entered the coffin. Air holes had been discreetly drilled. At 05:40, a funeral transport departed the hospital grounds. Documentation listed a civilian casualty from prior bombardment. German guards did not open coffins. Superstition, efficiency, and procedural discomfort combined to discourage interference. The vehicle reached a cemetery outside city limits. There, instead of burial, Chevalier was transferred to a waiting cart hidden beyond tree cover. By evening, he was 20 kilometers away. 3 weeks later, word returned through indirect channels. Chevalier had reached a resistance cell near Orléans. He was alive, and he was operational. The morgue extraction marked escalation. If discovered, consequences would be catastrophic. But it also demonstrated adaptability. The hospital was no longer merely moving men through service corridors. It was rewriting categories: patient, deceased, civilian. However, increased complexity introduced greater exposure. Every new method required more participants. More participants meant more potential fractures. And fractures, under interrogation, become entry points. In May 1941, a hospital orderly in Lille was detained for questioning unrelated to the extraction network, suspected of distributing underground pamphlets. He did not know details, but he knew enough to be dangerous if pressed. The Gestapo's involvement in hospital oversight began to deepen. Interrogations were not yet widespread, but they were approaching, and the network would soon face a challenge more dangerous than checkpoints. It would face scrutiny from within. The orderly from Lille was held for 3 days. No charges were announced, no formal accusation delivered. He was questioned about pamphlets, about acquaintances, about unusual nighttime activity inside the hospital. When he returned to work, he was quieter. He reported that the interrogators were less interested in printed material than in patterns. How often were patients transferred? Who authorized night movements? Why had certain files required repeated corrections? The questions were indirect, but they were informed. Information was traveling upward. Inside the Paris hospital, Madeleine adjusted immediately. Extraction frequency was reduced again. Communication signals were simplified. Some external contacts were temporarily severed to minimize traceable links. Compartmentalization tightened. From this point forward, no participant would know more than one stage of an operation. Ambulance drivers would not know shelter locations. Shelter contacts would not know document forgers. Clerks would not know patient identities. Even Madeleine began limiting her own exposure, delegating micro-decisions to trusted deputies without explaining full context. The network became cellular. Each cell could operate independently for a short period if others were compromised. Meanwhile, German oversight adopted a new tactic. Instead of visible inspections, they embedded observers. A civilian administrative assistant was assigned to support documentation efficiency. He worked quietly, reviewing logs, reorganizing files, making helpful suggestions. He asked careful questions, not accusatory, curious. Why did certain patients require multiple intra-hospital transfers? Why were infection rates inconsistent with broader statistics? Why did ambulance dispatch times cluster between 01 and 03? He was not Gestapo, but he was listening. Madeleine responded with transparency. Over-documentation became policy. Every minor shift change was logged. Every medication adjustment justified. Extra pages were added to files explaining routine anomalies in exhausting detail. Bureaucracy can suffocate suspicion. When overwhelmed with data, auditors often retreat to surface-level verification. The tactic worked, temporarily. Yet pressure continued elsewhere. In Reims, a convent shelter was searched after an anonymous tip. No soldiers were found. Extractions had been paused days earlier. But German officers recorded the names of all clergy present. One of those names later appeared in a separate interrogation file. The network realized a critical vulnerability. It relied on goodwill, and goodwill is fragile under fear. To reduce dependence on religious institutions, alternative shelters were identified. Abandoned farmhouses, unused vineyard storage buildings, vacant worker housing near factories damaged by bombing. Shelters became transient. No location would host more than one extracted soldier at a time. Movement schedules were shortened. Instead of 3-day staging, transfers occurred within 24 hours whenever possible. Speed replaced comfort. Then, in July 1941, the first direct breach occurred. A young nurse, recently transferred, not part of the original corps, reported irregularities to hospital administration. She had noticed discrepancies between patient registry copies and ward presence. Her report was procedural, not ideological. She believed errors were occurring. The administration escalated the issue to German supervisors. An internal review was ordered. For the first time, extraction records were examined line by line. Madeleine faced a decision. She could allow the review and hope procedural complexity concealed deviations, or she could sacrifice one operation to protect the rest. She chose containment. A recent transfer, legitimate but poorly timed, was identified as vulnerable. Documentation errors were deliberately exposed and framed as clerical negligence. Responsibility was assigned to a minor staff member, uninvolved in the network. The error appeared administrative, not conspiratorial. The staff member received formal reprimand. No arrests followed. The review concluded that confusion resulted from overwork and wartime strain. The young nurse who reported discrepancies was reassigned to a different department. Not punished, simply relocated. The network had survived its first internal exposure. But the cost was visible. Trust tightened further. New participants were no longer recruited easily. Every addition required observation over weeks. Casual conversation was reduced. Emotional expressions, relief, pride, grief, were suppressed. Extraction had become colder, more efficient, less human. Yet outside the hospital, the broader war was shifting.
Germany had launched operations eastward into Soviet territory. Casualty numbers rose dramatically. Medical transport capacity was strained. Administrative focus divided. This created opportunity. POW processing in France received less immediate attention. Camp overcrowding became severe. Transfers were delayed even without interference. Statistical noise increased. Within that noise, disappearance was easier to hide. Madeleine resumed operations at slightly higher frequency, but with refined precision. A new method emerged. Instead of extracting soldiers before official transfer, the network allowed some to be transported legitimately to smaller regional processing centers. From there, coordinated civilian contacts intercepted work details assigned outside camp walls. This reduced suspicion on hospitals directly. Responsibility shifted downstream. Risk was distributed geographically. In one case, a soldier assigned to agricultural labor near Dijon slipped away during irrigation work and was guided by local resistance members to a safe house. His initial hospital delay had ensured he was physically capable of enduring the escape. The hospital had become the first stage of a longer chain, not the final one. As operations diversified, record-keeping within the network grew entirely oral. No maps, no rosters. Memory became archive. That decision would later protect many participants, but it also meant that if leadership were removed, reconstruction would be nearly impossible. By autumn 1941, extraction numbers across occupied regions approached several dozen. Not hundreds, but enough to matter. German authorities began noticing discrepancies between hospital discharge totals and confirmed camp intakes. The difference was small, statistically defensible, but persistent. A regional Gestapo officer in Paris was assigned to review the matter specifically. His name was Obersturmführer Karl Weiss. Unlike routine auditors, Weiss specialized in pattern detection. He requested copies of hospital registries dating back 6 months. He compared them to transport manifests manually. He did not rely on summaries. He examined signatures, ink consistency, timing intervals. The network had faced bureaucracy. Now it faced investigation. And investigation, when patient, can unravel even disciplined systems. The hospital would soon discover that resistance through administration requires constant evolution. Because once someone begins looking not for errors, but for intention, even silence can appear suspicious. Obersturmführer Karl Weiss did not announce suspicion. He requested information, quietly. Copies of transfer lists, ambulance dispatch times, names of staff assigned to night rotations during specific weeks. He visited the hospital without escort on several occasions, walking corridors alone, observing how staff responded to unexpected presence. He did not intimidate overtly, he watched. What distinguished Weiss from previous officers was patience. He did not confront discrepancies immediately, he accumulated them. In his review, he noted something subtle. Many extracted soldiers, though he did not yet know they were extracted, shared similar medical trajectories. Extended recovery, just beyond average duration. At least one intra-hospital transfer before official discharge. Transport scheduled during late-night windows. Individually, each case was defensible. Collectively, they suggested coordination. Weiss requested interviews, not interrogations. Conversations. He began with administrative clerks, routine questions about workflow. How are transfer destinations selected? Who verifies receiving facility acknowledgement? How often are registry copies corrected? Answers were consistent, because they were true. The hospital did operate under strain. Corrections were frequent. Weiss then requested a meeting with Madeleine. The meeting took place in a small administrative office overlooking the courtyard. He did not accuse her. He complimented the hospital's efficiency under difficult circumstances. Then he asked, "Have you noticed irregularities in transport confirmations?" The question was precise. Madeleine answered without hesitation. Yes, several receiving facilities failed to return confirmation promptly. It has been an ongoing frustration. That was accurate. Some confirmations had indeed been delayed, intentionally redirected, or never sent. Weiss asked for examples. Madeleine provided 2 legitimate cases unrelated to extractions. Preparedness had become reflex. Weiss left without confrontation, but surveillance intensified. For the first time, plainclothes observers appeared in waiting areas. Ambulances were followed sporadically beyond hospital grounds. Municipal clerks reported increased review of identification requests. The network faced a new threat: correlation across departments. Previously, oversight had been compartmentalized. Hospital administrators reviewed medical logs. Transport officers reviewed vehicle usage. Municipal offices processed civilian documents. Weiss was connecting them. In response, Madeleine initiated structural fragmentation. Extraction routes were diversified further. No method would be used twice in succession. Morgue transfer was suspended entirely. Repetition risked detection. Ambulances were alternated with delivery trucks when feasible. Document sourcing shifted to smaller towns outside Paris jurisdiction. Most importantly, extraction timing became irregular. No more clustering between 01 and 03. Some transfers occurred near dawn, others during early evening amid legitimate activity. Predictability had been Weiss's advantage. Irregularity would become defense. But unpredictability increases operational strain. Mistakes multiply under variation. In November 1941, one nearly occurred. A forged identity card contained a subtle error. A municipal code outdated by recent administrative restructuring. The error was detected at a rural checkpoint by a German officer unusually familiar with local governance. The extracted soldier was detained temporarily. He maintained composure, claiming displacement due to bombing had caused document confusion. The officer sent inquiry to municipal records. Because the code corresponded to a real but discontinued district, the clerk, part of the broader network, verified identity without hesitation. The soldier was released. The margin had been narrow. Afterward, document protocols were revised. All templates would be cross-checked against most recent administrative circulars. No reliance on memory alone. Meanwhile, Weiss's review deepened. He requested camp intake records from Germany for cross-reference. This was dangerous. Hospital discrepancies could be disguised locally. They could not be erased from central camp data. However, the war's expansion eastward strained communication. Camp records were delayed, incomplete, sometimes inaccurate. Bureaucratic overload worked temporarily in the network's favor. Still, Weiss identified 3 names transferred from the Paris hospital with no corresponding camp intake within expected timeframes. He summoned the hospital director. The director, not part of the extraction network, was unaware of deliberate removals. He attributed discrepancies to transport rerouting due to rail disruptions. Bombings had indeed damaged several lines. Weiss accepted the explanation provisionally, but he ordered direct verification. From this point forward, hospital transfers would require telegraphic confirmation from receiving facilities within 24 hours. This directive threatened the network's foundation. Forgery could handle paper. Telegraphic verification required coordinated response at destination. The system would need to expand again, or cease. Madeleine convened her inner circle, 4 individuals only. Options were evaluated. Bribery of telegraph operators? Too unstable. Interception of telegrams? Impractical without broader resistance integration. Limiting extractions exclusively to facilities controlled by sympathizers? Possible, but narrow. A new strategy emerged. Instead of falsifying receipt at destination facilities, the network would use legitimate but distant hospitals as temporary waypoints, facilities overwhelmed and disorganized, where confirmation delays were plausible. An extracted soldier would be transferred officially to such a hospital. Before confirmation was requested, he would be moved again, internally, by Allied staff within that facility. In effect, the disappearance would occur 1 layer removed from the origin hospital. Risk was transferred downstream. Coordination required trust beyond Paris. Lille and Reims were contacted through pre-existing informal channels. Select individuals agreed to participate. The network was now regional. But regional networks create broader exposure. If Weiss extended investigation beyond Paris, patterns might emerge across cities. Time was shrinking. Then, in January 1942, an arrest changed the balance. A municipal clerk in Paris, not central to the extraction network, but occasionally cooperative, was detained on unrelated black market charges. During interrogation, investigators discovered irregular issuance of identity documents. Under pressure, the clerk disclosed that certain hospital referrals seemed unusual. Names were mentioned, not accusations, but enough to trigger focused inquiry. Weiss returned to the hospital with formal authority. This time, interviews were not conversational. They were structured. Individual staff were separated, questioned about specific dates, specific patients, specific transfer times. The network's greatest defense had always been distributed knowledge. Now that defense would be tested. If even one participant revealed operational sequence, correlation could become proof. Madeleine prepared for the possibility that silence might no longer be sufficient. Contingency plans were activated. Files linked to prior extractions were quietly destroyed or altered. Some participants were instructed to distance themselves from night rotations temporarily. External shelters were warned to suspend intake. For the first time since 1940, the network faced existential threat. Extraction had always balanced risk against necessity. Now risk outweighed capacity. Yet cessation would not erase past operations. Investigation was already in motion. And investigation, once escalated to formal interrogation, does not retreat easily. The hospital corridors grew quieter, not because activity ceased, but because everyone understood that observation had intensified beyond routine oversight. The war inside the wards had shifted from movement to endurance. Because sometimes survival in resistance requires not action, but stillness. And stillness, under scrutiny, is the hardest discipline of all. The first formal arrest came before dawn. Not dramatic, not violent. 2 officers arrived with written authorization and requested that nurse Claire Moreau accompany them for clarification of documentation procedures. She was one of the inner circle, not the architect, but close enough to understand patterns. Claire did not resist. Resistance at the point of arrest only narrows options. She was transported to a regional security office, not a prison, but not a hospital either. The room where questioning occurred was sparsely furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a file already prepared. Weiss entered after an hour. He placed 3 documents on the table: transfer orders, registry copies, camp intake lists. He did not accuse, he asked for explanation. Why does this soldier not appear in intake records? Claire reviewed the documents slowly. She responded as trained. Transport disruptions were frequent, rail lines damaged, confirmation delays common. Weiss nodded. He asked about internal transfers before discharge. Infection control, she replied. Standard practice. He shifted tone. Have you ever altered a medical chart? The question was direct. The truthful answer, in any hospital under strain, would be yes. Corrections happen constantly. Claire answered accordingly. Corrections occur when information updates. Weiss studied her for a long moment. He did not threaten. He described consequences. Administrative negligence during wartime could be interpreted as sabotage. Sabotage carried severe penalties. He asked again, have you knowingly falsified documentation? Claire maintained composure. No. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. No physical coercion. Not yet. Psychological pressure was applied instead. Isolation. Silence between questions. Repetition of timelines. Claire returned to the hospital that evening. She had revealed nothing operational, but she had learned something critical. Weiss did not possess proof. He possessed suspicion. Suspicion requires confirmation. The network still had advantage. For now. Madeleine evaluated the situation with precision. If Weiss escalated to coercive interrogation, silence would become harder to sustain. Even the strongest resolve fractures under sustained pressure. So the network shifted strategy again. Extraction operations were halted indefinitely, not paused, stopped. No removals, no internal transfers beyond medical necessity. The hospital would return to strict compliance, visibly, measurably. Transfer times would occur during daylight. Documentation would be impeccable. Confirmation telegrams would be requested proactively. The objective was statistical normalization. If discrepancies ceased, suspicion might cool. Meanwhile, contingency protocols were activated for potential arrests. Each core participant prepared a plausible narrative explaining minor documentation irregularities as wartime strain. No one rehearsed a shared story. Consistency under interrogation often exposes coordination. Instead, each would rely on truth fragments, fatigue, shortages, clerical overload. Weeks passed. Weiss continued audits but found no new anomalies. Camp intake records aligned with transfers. Ambulance logs were clean. Telegraphic confirmations arrived on time. The hospital appeared exemplary. Externally, however, consequences rippled. Without hospital stage extraction, POW transfers to Germany increased. Several soldiers previously assessed as candidates were transported east before alternative plans could form. The network had preserved itself, but at cost. Morale inside the wards shifted again. Soldiers sensed that hope had receded. The nurses did not explain. Explanation creates liability. Then, in March 1942, an unexpected development altered the balance. A German medical officer assigned temporarily to the hospital, Dr. Friedrich Keller, requested private conversation with Madeleine. Keller was not part of security apparatus. He was a surgeon, transferred from the Eastern Front for recovery after minor injury. He had observed ward operations for weeks. His request was discreet. In a supply room, away from main corridors, he spoke plainly. "You are careful," he said, "but not invisible." Madeleine did not respond immediately. Keller continued. "I have reviewed older records before increased scrutiny." Silence held. Then he said something unexpected. "I have a brother in a camp near Dresden. He writes that conditions are deteriorating. Many prisoners will not survive winter." He did not accuse. He did not threaten. He implied. Whether Keller sought moral absolution or strategic advantage was unclear, but his awareness was dangerous. Madeleine faced a decision in that moment: deny entirely, risk antagonizing him, or acknowledge partially, risk exposure. She chose neither. She asked a question instead. "Why are you telling me this?" Keller answered without hesitation. "Because I am a physician before I am anything else." It was not a declaration of alliance, but it was not hostility. Keller offered nothing further. He left the supply room and resumed duty. From that day forward, he never referenced the matter again. However, his presence altered calculations. If even one German medical officer suspected past extraction activity but chose silence, the network's survival might depend not only on concealment, but on individual conscience within the occupying force. This variable was unpredictable. Weiss, meanwhile, intensified his review of the municipal clerk's interrogation notes. Under pressure, the clerk had mentioned irregular hospital referrals, but could not specify names accurately. The information was fragmented. Without corroboration, Weiss lacked prosecutable evidence. In April 1942, he was reassigned temporarily to investigate rail sabotage in another region. The hospital remained under supervision, but without his focused scrutiny. The network had endured its most dangerous phase. But survival required assessment. Could operations resume? Or had visibility permanently increased beyond safe threshold? Madeleine convened the inner circle again. Claire, recently interrogated, advised caution. Another nurse argued that the window might reopen, with Weiss reassigned. Mark, the ambulance driver, reported increased patrol unpredictability on rural roads. External shelters remained operational, but wary. The network had to choose between dormancy and adaptation. Dormancy protected participants. Adaptation protected soldiers. After extended discussion, a revised doctrine emerged. Extraction would resume, but only for cases meeting stricter criteria. Immediate risk of execution or forced transfer to high-mortality camps. Viable long-distance escape routes confirmed. Minimal documentation manipulation required. Volume would remain low. Precision would increase. The network had matured from opportunistic defiance to strategic intervention. The next operation would occur months later, and it would test whether restraint had restored invisibility or whether scrutiny simply waited for the next mistake. Because in occupied France, survival did not mean safety. It meant temporary absence of detection. And detection, once awakened, rarely sleeps forever. The officer on the list. The next candidate was not selected by hope, he was selected by urgency. Captain Luc Morel had been transferred to the hospital from a temporary holding facility outside Rouen. He was not severely wounded, a deep laceration to the thigh, partially infected but healing. What made his case different was intelligence value. Morel had served in logistics coordination before France's collapse. During initial interrogation at the holding facility, he had refused cooperation. His name was marked in German administrative correspondence as non-compliant. That designation reduced his margin of survival. Intelligence officers often separated such prisoners for harsher processing. Madeleine learned of the annotation through indirect means. Dr. Keller, reviewing shared medical files, had quietly left a folder open longer than necessary. The note was visible. No words were exchanged. The implication was enough. Under the revised doctrine, Morel qualified. Immediate risk, transfer imminent, extraction viable. Preparation required extraordinary restraint. Unlike earlier operations, no extended artificial delays would be added to his chart. Sudden change after months of compliance would reawaken suspicion. Instead, the infection would progress naturally, but not be treated as aggressively as possible. Recovery would plateau rather than accelerate. The plateau bought days. Meanwhile, an escape corridor towards Switzerland was evaluated. Rural resistance contacts confirmed that border patrol density fluctuated with weather and troop redeployment cycles. Late spring offered increased agricultural traffic, useful camouflage. Identity preparation adopted a new approach. Morel would not assume a fabricated civilian identity. He would travel, initially, under legitimate prisoner transfer documentation, but intercepted en route. The risk was extreme. Interception required coordination beyond hospital network, including rail workers and rural resistance cells capable of creating controlled delay without overt sabotage. The advantage: the hospital's direct responsibility would end at departure. If Morel disappeared during transit, suspicion would distribute across transport chain. Mark re-entered the plan after months of limited involvement. He would not drive the initial leg. Official transport convoys were handled by German-controlled vehicles. But he would position himself along secondary roadways near a scheduled rest stop used by prisoner convoys during long transfers. The key variable was timing. Convoys adhered to strict schedules, but small adjustments were common due to fuel stops or mechanical inspection. A sympathetic railway clerk provided anticipated departure time from Paris. The convoy would carry 12 prisoners. Morel would be among them. Extraction could not endanger the others. Direct attack was impossible. Instead, the plan hinged on medical pretext. The day before departure, Morel's infection was documented as unstable but transportable under supervision. During convoy rest stop, if he displayed signs of medical distress, real or simulated, a transfer to local medical care could be requested. Dr. Keller, officially assigned to oversee prisoner health documentation for transfers that week, approved a note indicating risk of fever relapse. It was a narrow opening. On departure morning, the convoy left under armed guard. Madeleine did not watch it go. Operational distance had become necessary for clarity. At the designated rest stop, approximately 80 kilometers south, Morel executed his role precisely. He collapsed during brief disembarkation for supervised rest. Guards summoned the accompanying medic. The medic reviewed documentation and hesitated. Fever risk noted. Infection potential. Continuing journey without evaluation might risk prisoner death, administratively inconvenient. A decision was made. Morel would be transferred temporarily to a nearby rural clinic for assessment. The rest of the convoy continued. The clinic had been pre-selected. Its senior nurse was not part of the hospital's original network, but she had agreed to assist in emergencies. Morel arrived mid-afternoon. Under examination, his fever appeared genuine, induced earlier through controlled dehydration and mild exposure overnight. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to justify observation. At dusk, a civilian delivery cart arrived at the clinic carrying medical supplies. Inside the supply crates, clothing, forged travel papers, ration cards. By midnight, Morel had exited through rear service door. Mark met him 2 kilometers away. The route towards Switzerland would require multiple stages: farmhouses, river crossings, rail segments under civilian guise. The hospital's involvement ended there. Days later, coded confirmation reached Paris. Morel had crossed into Swiss territory, alive. The operation demonstrated evolution. The hospital no longer needed to control every stage. It initiated divergence points within the system itself, but divergence increases unpredictability. 1 week after Morel's disappearance, Weiss returned to Paris. His rail sabotage investigation had concluded. He resumed review of prisoner discrepancies. Morel's absence from camp intake records was noticed immediately. Unlike previous cases, transfer documentation showed departure from hospital and presence in convoy manifest. The discrepancy occurred downstream. Weiss shifted focus accordingly. Transport officers were questioned. Convoy guards were interrogated about the rest stop. The rural clinic received inquiry. Its senior nurse reported fever relapse and transfer to regional medical authority for further evaluation. That secondary transfer was documented. But beyond that point, records dissolved. Weiss began mapping timeline gaps. Unlike earlier hospital-focused suspicion, this investigation spanned multiple jurisdictions. The hospital's direct exposure was reduced, but not eliminated. If correlation returned to earlier discrepancies, pattern recognition might re-emerge. Madeleine anticipated this. She ordered total cessation of operations again. But this time, suspension was accompanied by structural dismantling. External document sources were closed. Shelter contacts were advised to sever hospital linkage entirely. Mark withdrew from all visible association with medical transport for several months. The network would not disband, but it would dissolve into dormant fragments. Cells would retain memory, no active coordination. This decision was not unanimous. Some argued momentum should continue, while Weiss's focus was elsewhere. Madeleine disagreed. "Pattern forms through repetition," she said quietly. "We will not give him repetition." Dormancy extended through summer 1942. Inside the hospital, routine returned. Transfers occurred transparently. Camp intake confirmations aligned. Weiss's reports grew less pointed. Yet external conditions worsened. As the war expanded, occupation policies hardened. Deportations increased. Not only soldiers, but civilians targeted under new directives. Hospitals began receiving not only wounded POWs, but detainees from political sweeps. The moral landscape shifted. Extraction would soon confront not only military prisoners, but civilians facing transport eastward under far darker classifications. The network's original mission had focused on soldiers. Soon, its boundaries would be tested, because resistance rarely remains confined to its initial definition. And as categories of victim expanded, so would the question facing those inside the wards. If you can remove one man from the machinery, what justifies leaving another inside it? By late 1942, the character of those arriving at the hospital had altered. They were no longer exclusively uniformed soldiers. Among the wounded and sick, were civilians detained during political raids, teachers accused of distributing pamphlets, railway workers suspected of sabotage, students arrested for possessing foreign broadcasts. Some bore visible injuries from interrogation. Others carried no physical wounds at all, only documentation ordering medical clearance before transfer east. East no longer meant standard POW camps. It meant forced labor installations under harsher administration. Survival rates were lower, return unlikely. The hospital's mandate remained clinical: treat, stabilize, release for transport. The network faced a structural dilemma. Its doctrine had been built around military prisoners, individuals whose disappearance could be explained within POW administrative chaos. Civilians under political detention were tracked differently. Files were more centralized. Interrogation notes accompanied medical records. Their transfers were often monitored by security officers rather than standard transport guards. Extraction risk multiplied. Madeleine resisted expansion initially. The network was already fragile, but events forced reassessment. A schoolteacher named Etienne Renaud arrived under guard with fractured ribs and internal bruising. His medical file contained interrogation annotations labeling him agitator. His transfer date was set for 10 days after stabilization. Unlike soldiers, Renaud did not possess rural family connections. He had no safe agricultural background to assume. His identity was already politically flagged. Extraction would require full reinvention. The inner circle debated. Claire argued that refusal would fracture morale internally. Staff had begun witnessing civilian brutality directly. Mark warned that political detainee disappearance would draw faster retaliation. Dr. Keller, though not formally part of the network, had grown increasingly indirect in his support, adjusting documentation subtly to grant marginal time extensions. In Renaud's case, Keller prolonged observation under the justification of lung complications. Time extended to 17 days. The network used that window to explore new strategy. Unlike soldiers, civilians could blend into urban environments more effectively, if documentation supported them. A contact in Lyon, previously uninvolved, offered forged labor permits for factory relocation programs. Such permits authorized civilian movement between industrial regions due to workforce shortages. If Renaud could be reclassified administratively as displaced labor, rather than political detainee, tracking would weaken. This required manipulation at higher level. A hospital administrative assistant, sympathetic but cautious, agreed to alter classification code within Renaud's discharge summary, replacing political detention marker with civilian displaced due to civil unrest. It was a subtle change, but it redirected his file into a different bureaucratic stream. On extraction night, procedure differed from prior military operations. No convoy interception, no rural shelter first. Renaud was transferred under legitimate discharge to Municipal Labor Office for reassignment. Instead of reporting, he diverted immediately to a safe apartment arranged by urban resistance contacts. From there, new documents were issued indicating factory placement in southern France. Within weeks, he relocated successfully. The operation expanded the network's scope, but consequences followed. Political detainee files were audited more aggressively than military POWs. Weiss's office received notice that one reclassified detainee had failed to report to labor authority. Inquiry traced back to hospital discharge documentation. For the first time, suspicion extended beyond prisoner transport into civilian classification. Weiss returned, again, this time with broader authority. He summoned not only medical staff, but municipal labor officials. Cross-examination began. Madeleine sensed escalation. She instructed all participants to revert fully to non-intervention posture. No more civilian extractions, no deviations. But the climate had changed irreversibly. The hospital now received regular visits from security personnel, accompanying detainees directly during treatment. Guards remained inside wards, not outside corridors. Documentation copies were collected daily, rather than weekly. Observation was no longer episodic. It was embedded. Under such conditions, extraction seemed impossible. Yet pressure to act intensified. Reports filtered in through indirect channels. Deportation trains increasing, camps overcrowded, mortality rising. Inside the hospital, staff morale strained. Nurses who had never been part of the inner circle began asking quiet questions. "Can nothing be done?" Madeleine answered carefully. Action without margin destroys more than it saves. But even she felt the weight of inaction. The network had survived by adaptation and restraint. Now restraint bordered on paralysis. Then an unexpected shift altered calculations once more. In November 1942, Allied forces landed in North Africa. German command responded by fully occupying previously unoccupied southern France. Administrative resources were redistributed rapidly. Troop movements intensified. Communication channels strained. In chaos, oversight fragments. Hospitals experienced sudden influx of wounded German soldiers redeployed from southern operations. Medical capacity stretched thin. Attention diverted. Within that disruption, small openings reappeared. Not broad enough for large-scale extraction, but sufficient for targeted intervention. The network, though dormant, remained intact in memory. Madeleine reassembled the core quietly. "We will not return to volume," she said. "We will act only where delay equals death." The first case under renewed doctrine involved a teenage courier captured with resistance leaflets. Severely beaten, he required surgical intervention. His file labeled him terrorist collaborator. Transfer scheduled upon stabilization. Unlike prior operations, extraction would not attempt reintegration into French territory. The plan aimed for immediate cross-border movement towards Spain via Pyrenean routes, coordinated with established escape lines used for Allied airmen. Hospital involvement would end at safe-house stage. Execution required speed. Surgical recovery shortened deliberately through aggressive treatment. Once ambulatory, the courier was classified as suitable for psychiatric observation, exploiting administrative confusion surrounding youth detainees. Psychiatric transfers were less predictable and often less guarded. Under that classification, he was moved to an auxiliary facility with minimal security presence. From there, urban resistance contacts assumed control. Within weeks, confirmation arrived. He had reached neutral territory. The extraction signaled that the network could still function, but only under narrow windows created by external upheaval. War's expansion both increased danger and produced distraction. Yet Weiss remained active. He recognized that oversight fatigue during military redeployment could conceal administrative manipulation. He accelerated review processes rather than relaxing them. In early 1943, he implemented random spot verifications of discharged detainees, dispatching officers to confirm physical presence at assigned labor sites. This innovation threatened civilian extraction methods directly. The hospital's margin shrank again. At this stage, resistance inside the wards was no longer sustainable through documentation alone. Future operations would require coordination with armed cells outside and acceptance of greater exposure. Madeleine understood the trajectory. Administrative resistance had reached its limit. Beyond this point, continuation would intersect directly with overt underground networks. And overt networks, once penetrated, trigger arrests not of individuals, but of structures. The hospital had survived through invisibility. Integration with broader resistance would sacrifice that invisibility. The decision ahead would determine whether the night network remained a quiet corridor of survival or became part of a louder war unfolding beyond hospital walls. The winter of 1943 hardened everything. Fuel was scarce. Coal shipments were diverted toward military logistics. Hospital corridors grew colder. Windows remained sealed to conserve heat. Patients recovered more slowly in chilled wards. Malnutrition was no longer confined to prisoners. Civilian rationing reduced caloric intake across the city. Nurses skipped meals to reserve portions for the weakest patients. Doctors performed surgery under dimmed lighting during power restrictions. War had moved beyond battlefronts and into infrastructure. Within this deterioration, resistance networks across France intensified activity. Railway sabotage increased. Communication lines were cut with greater frequency. German countermeasures escalated proportionally. Hospitals, by virtue of treating both occupiers and occupied, became zones of strategic interest. The night network's earlier doctrine, delay, document, divert, had relied on bureaucratic opacity, but opacity was thinning. In February 1943, a railway derailment outside Paris killed several German soldiers. Retaliatory arrests followed immediately. Among detainees brought to the hospital for medical clearance was a machinist named Luc Bernard. He had been seized in a factory sweep. No direct evidence tied him to sabotage, but arrest quotas required fulfillment. Bernard's injuries were minimal. He would recover quickly. His transfer order was scheduled within 72 hours. Under earlier conditions, the network could have extended his medical observation. Now, security officers remained inside treatment rooms for politically sensitive detainees. Madeleine evaluated options and rejected conventional delay. Instead, she authorized something new: indirect substitution. The plan required cooperation beyond hospital staff. Mark contacted a railway worker affiliated with a separate resistance cell. They identified another detainee, an older man, already terminally ill from advanced tuberculosis. His prognosis was poor. Transfer east would almost certainly result in death within weeks. Documentation adjustment would be minimal. If identities could be swapped administratively, Bernard might be released under the deceased man's file, while the terminal patient, unlikely to survive regardless, would remain registered as Bernard. The moral calculus was brutal. It meant manipulating two fates simultaneously. Claire opposed it initially. "We are deciding who disappears." Madeleine answered evenly. "We are deciding who has a future." The substitution required precision. Patient bracelets were exchanged during night rounds. Charts were rewritten by hand. The administrative assistant altered numerical identifiers within the discharge ledger, small enough not to attract attention, but sufficient to redirect paperwork streams. The terminal patient died 3 days later. Under the swapped file, his death closed Bernard's official record. Bernard, now carrying the identity of the deceased, was released as unfit for transport due to medical deterioration. He exited under supervision of municipal burial documentation procedures, which required minimal oversight. From there, resistance contacts relocated him to rural territory. The operation succeeded, but its ethical cost lingered among participants. The network had crossed a boundary, from delaying deportation to reallocating identities based on survival probability. The war had forced triage beyond medicine. Weeks later, Weiss uncovered discrepancies in burial records. A transport manifest listed Bernard as deceased before arrival at camp intake. Weiss began reconstructing timelines backward. His approach shifted from reactive investigation to proactive infiltration. He assigned an officer to pose as an injured civilian detainee, seeking to observe hospital staff interactions directly. The man arrived with superficial injuries consistent with factory accident. His documentation identified him as suspected sympathizer. Inside the ward, he watched. Nurses performed standard care. Documentation followed protocol. No irregularities surfaced. But the network had been alerted through informal warning channels. Madeleine instructed complete suspension of any intervention during his stay. For 9 days, the hospital operated with rigid conformity. The infiltrator reported nothing actionable. Yet Weiss did not withdraw. He understood resistance networks function through trust and pattern recognition. A single clean audit proved little. Instead, he altered strategy again. Rather than focusing solely on prisoner disappearance, he began tracking staff movement outside hospital grounds. Curfews were strict, but essential personnel held travel permits. If nurses were coordinating beyond wards, patterns might emerge. Surveillance extended into streets. Claire noticed first. A man appearing at different intersections over consecutive evenings, always at distance, always stationary. She altered routes unpredictably thereafter. Madeleine reduced meetings to 0. Instructions were transmitted through prearranged visual signals within the hospital itself. Placement of medical trays, rotation of supply cabinets, sequence of folded linens on preparation tables. Communication became architectural. Meanwhile, Allied bombing intensified over industrial zones in northern France. Casualties surged. German wounded filled sections of the hospital once reserved for civilians. Resource allocation shifted. Ironically, increased German presence created both hazard and shield. With wards overcrowded, documentation backlog grew. Weiss's investigative bandwidth divided between internal security and military casualty processing. The night network resumed limited action under cover of administrative overload. In April 1943, 2 captured Allied airmen were delivered discreetly to the hospital after emergency landing mishap. Unlike French detainees, these men were high-value prisoners. Their transfer to interrogation centers was prioritized. The resistance outside urgently requested assistance. Extraction would require speed measured in hours, not days. The network adapted once more. Surgical reports exaggerated spinal injury severity for 1 airman, indicating paralysis risk if moved prematurely. The second was classified as requiring isolation due to suspected infectious condition, triggering quarantine protocol. Quarantine restricted guard access. Within isolation, a false wall panel previously installed for maintenance access became conduit. Local resistance operatives accessed the building through service tunnels used historically for coal delivery. Both airmen were transferred within 48 hours of arrival. Their absence was discovered quickly. Weiss's response was immediate and severe. Multiple staff were detained for questioning, though not yet arrested formally. Interrogations lasted hours. Sleep deprivation tactics employed. Madeleine endured questioning without deviation. She referenced surgical protocols, medical ethics, patient privacy regulations. No direct evidence linked her. But Weiss escalated further. He ordered complete personnel review, including background checks reaching back pre-war years. The network now operated under sustained threat of exposure. Some members considered withdrawal permanently. Claire, exhausted, voiced what others hesitated to say. If we stop, at least we live. Madeleine did not respond immediately. She had begun to understand something fundamental. The hospital was no longer merely a site of opportunity. It had become a front line. Not because of ideology, but because the occupation had penetrated every neutral space. To withdraw would not restore safety. It would only concede ground. Yet continuing meant eventual confrontation. By mid-1943, arrests across Paris resistance networks increased dramatically. Entire cells dismantled within weeks due to infiltration and torture-derived intelligence. The night network had survived by isolation. Now isolation was thinning. Weiss compiled a consolidated report, requesting authority for coordinated arrests if sufficient evidence emerged. Approval required higher command's signature. While bureaucratic processes advanced slowly, they advanced nonetheless. Time was compressing. Inside the hospital, operations slowed to near stillness. Every action weighed against cumulative risk. But events beyond their control would soon remove the option of measured restraint. In early 1944, preparations for a large-scale Allied offensive became evident through increased aerial reconnaissance and intensified bombing. German command tightened internal security preemptively. Emergency decrees expanded arrest powers. Hospitals were instructed to report any irregular patient movement immediately. Under these directives, Weiss gained expanded jurisdiction. He no longer needed conclusive proof. Suspicion alone justified detention. The night network stood at the edge of exposure, and the next decision would not be about saving one prisoner at a time. It would determine whether the entire structure could survive the final year of occupation. By spring 1944, the hospital no longer resembled the institution it had been 4 years earlier. The corridors were thinner, not physically, but psychologically. Every footstep carried calculation. Every conversation ended before it began. Weiss had obtained expanded arrest authority in March. The order was not public, but its effects were immediate. 2 junior clerks from another municipal hospital disappeared overnight after a discrepancy in patient routing. The message was clear. Administrative resistance was no longer being tolerated. Inside the wards, the night network did not formally dissolve. It simply stopped speaking its own name. No meetings, no signals, no shared glances. Yet the memory of coordination remained, and memory can be operational. Then came June 6, 1944. The Allied landings in Normandy altered the geometry of the war. German command began rapid redeployments northward. Casualties multiplied. Supply lines strained. Transportation grids destabilized. Paris was not yet liberated, but the occupation was under pressure. In response, German authorities accelerated prisoner transfers eastward. Political detainees, resistance suspects, and military prisoners were consolidated for mass deportations before front lines shifted. Speed replaced procedure. In this compression, mistakes reappeared. Records were rushed. Verification weakened. The night network recognized a final window. Not a prolonged campaign, a single phase. Between June and August 1944, transports increased dramatically. The hospital received detainees briefly for medical certification before rail departure. The new pattern created short, high-risk opportunities. Madeleine called no meeting. She issued no instruction. Instead, during one late-night round, she said quietly to Claire, "If there is to be an end, let it mean something." The first opportunity came with 3 resistance couriers captured during a radio equipment seizure. Their injuries were minor. Their transport scheduled within 48 hours. Under previous conditions, extraction would have required layered planning. Now, speed was the only resource. Documentation marked one of the couriers as suffering internal hemorrhage risk, requiring observation. The other 2 were assigned pre-transport vaccination procedures. Vaccination rooms were temporary installations in lower service corridors. During movement between wards and corridor stations, an air raid siren sounded. Allied bombers were targeting rail infrastructure outside the city. Protocol required relocation of patients to reinforced interior sections. In that confusion, 2 couriers disappeared into maintenance passages, pre-mapped years earlier for coal delivery routes. The third remained under observation legitimately, delaying his transport long enough for external resistance units to sabotage the rail line scheduled for his departure. The train never left. It was destroyed outside the city before boarding. The window had opened wider than expected. Rail disruptions multiplied through July. Each disruption forced administrative recalculation. Transport manifests were rewritten repeatedly. In that instability, 6 additional detainees were diverted across separate operations. Not large numbers, not dramatic rescues, but each one represented removal from an irreversible trajectory. Weiss was no longer operating methodically. He was reacting. His superiors demanded efficiency amid retreat. His authority remained intact, but his resources were stretched thin. On July 20th, news of an assassination attempt against Hitler reached occupied France. Security forces intensified internal vigilance. Weiss ordered immediate detention of several hospital staff members for questioning, including Mark. Mark did not return. No formal charges were issued. No documentation released. He vanished into the same system the network had spent 4 years undermining. Madeleine received confirmation indirectly. A guard who had once accepted cigarettes in exchange for silence whispered a camp destination. There would be no extraction. The network did not fracture publicly, but something essential hardened. In August 1944, Paris rose. Street fighting began as resistance forces engaged retreating German units. Hospitals filled with civilian casualties and combatants alike. German administrative structures collapsed unevenly. Some officers fled. Others attempted to destroy records. Weiss remained. On August 23rd, he entered the hospital with a reduced escort, demanding access to personnel files. Madeleine met him in the administrative corridor, where their confrontations had begun years earlier. There were no guards posted now, only distant sounds of gunfire. Weiss informed her that several patient records would be transferred to military custody immediately. She responded that records had already been evacuated due to bombardment risk. It was partially true. Over previous nights, staff had removed critical documentation linking disappearances to hospital origin. Files burned in controlled furnace batches. Ledger pages dissolved in chemical solution. The paper trail was ending. Weiss searched the archive room personally. Shelves were incomplete, cross-references broken. His methodical framework had no structure left to examine. Outside, resistance fighters advanced street by street. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. German command withdrew or surrendered. Weiss was arrested 2 days later by French authorities re-establishing civil control. His files, incomplete and fragmented, failed to produce immediate indictments against hospital staff. The night network never appeared in formal resistance rosters. No medals were issued, no commemorative plaques installed in corridors. The nurses returned to standard uniforms. Wards reopened under French administration. Some of those smuggled to safety rejoined liberated units. Others disappeared into post-war anonymity. Mark's fate was confirmed months later through camp liberation records. He did not survive the winter of 1944. Madeleine continued working at the hospital until 1952. She never wrote memoirs. Claire transferred to pediatric care and refused interviews decades later when historians began reconstructing civilian resistance roles. Official war narratives focus on armies, divisions, offensives. They chart troop movements and political declarations. But occupation is also fought in quieter spaces, in chart entries altered by a single word, in a bracelet switched during a midnight round, in a door left unlatched for 12 seconds longer than necessary. The night nurses did not carry weapons. They carried clipboards. They did not sabotage bridges. They sabotaged paperwork. Their resistance was procedural, administrative, calculated. And it saved lives measured not in hundreds, but in individuals whose absence from transport lists changed family histories permanently. War leaves visible ruins. It also leaves invisible corridors where decisions were made without witnesses. In one hospital under occupation, between 1940 and 1944, a small group of nurses chose to weaponize bureaucracy against the system that sought to control it. They did not call themselves heroes. They called themselves staff. And they worked the night shift.